Hello, welcome to the International Business Conversations. My name is Irina Goch, and today my guest is Professor Carolina Castaldi. Carolina, hello, how are you?
Oh, good. Good morning. Nice being here.
Thank you very much for your time today. So today we are talking about intellectual property. My first question is, can you please introduce yourself and tell me what you do?
Yes, so I'm a full professor at the Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and my chair is in Geography of Innovation. So I've been doing research on innovation for quite some time at different levels of analysis. I like to study how innovation processes develop over time, but also in space. And so my connection to intellectual property and intellectual property rights is that when you talk about innovation and the way companies might want to protect their innovation, then you end up also being interested in intellectual property and intellectual property rights.
What is intellectual property and why is it so important for business? Can you also please provide some examples?
Yes, so intellectual property is different from physical property as you would think of. So a company might own buildings, machineries, computers, everything that can be touched and it's physical, tangible. But then it also has lots of assets that are intangible, so they cannot be touched. And intangible assets, of which intellectual property is a large part, are becoming more and more important for companies. Actually, I've been reading this great book, Capitalism Without Capital, which makes exactly this point. So the factories of companies are becoming empty, and what you see instead is that companies' most important assets are their ideas, their technologies, their reputation, business models. So a lot of intangible property.
What are the different types of intellectual properties?
So I think I already mentioned a few examples, but so considering what typically comes up in corporate accounts, we see often technologies as often measured by patents that are filed and registered by the companies, but also R&D investment. But we also see brands measured, for instance, by trademarks or the value of those brands. And there are many more. So think of also copyrights, licensing of all kinds of intellectual property. They can show up in companies' accounts, and they can often be valued as a large share of companies' market value. And so for some of the, let's say, tech companies, digital companies, these assets can even sum up to even 90% of their market value. So that's quite substantial.
Let's say I create a new technology and I will apply for a patent to protect my technology. Will this patent protect my intellectual property from being copied around the world?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So it is important when you want to get a patent registered that you are able to claim that you are the first in the world to have come up with that idea and also have filed it at a patent office. And so typically you can leverage an international patent application procedure. And then it doesn't really matter where you file the first patent, but it matters that you did file one, and that gives you so-called priority. And so it says, okay, you were the first in the world to claim that idea. Still, even if you have a patent, that doesn't mean that you are protected against imitation. It's a right, so you have the right to prevent others from using the same technology, but it's also a right that you have to exercise. And so only when a company actively monitors possible imitation used by others of the same technology, and then intervenes, for instance, informing the other company that they should stop using the technology, or even starting a lawsuit, only then that right is exercised. And so we see that this is might be an issue for small companies who don't have the budget to monitor all possible uses or to start lawsuits, while large companies typically have a whole battery of lawyers, legal departments, whose basically main task is also to monitor and make sure that indeed that the patented technology of the company is not used by others.
Are countries different in terms of how well they can protect intellectual property of those companies that invest in those countries?
Yes, we see major differences in the strength of IP protection in countries. So the possibilities for companies to have their legal right protected differs quite a bit. We also see that the fact that the country has weak IP protection might deter foreign direct investment to these countries. So we see that. We also see that a lot of trade agreements, for instance, TRIPS, include much tax on IP. So that's important for companies that investing abroad, that they also can trust that they have similar conditions to local companies when it comes to IP, for instance. So there is a common ground of IP regulations that both investing companies and local companies can rely on.
You mentioned that a weaker intellectual property protection that is available in the country may deter multinationals from investing there. However, sometimes we see that multinationals do invest in countries with, let's say, intellectual protection that may be less effective than they would like it to be. Why do you think that is the case?
So in general, you would say, okay, weak regulations are a deterrent to investment. Yet investment decisions are influenced by many more factors than simply IP regulations. So think about existence of a lenient fiscal regime or many other characteristics of the institutional context of a country. So we see indeed foreign direct investment also flow into countries with weak IP regulations or institutions, and we also see that the strong IP regulations are not sufficient for attracting foreign direct investment. So the relation is much more complex, right? So the decision is influenced by many more factors than simply IP.
When two companies decide to form a joint venture, the issue of intellectual property misappropriation becomes very important. What are the strategies to mitigate possible risks?
Indeed. So collaboration among companies, for instance, in the form of joint venture, but also strategic alliance is something that happens often. And IP considerations are important. So what we see is that companies do try to include many lines on IP in their contracts when they start really a formal type of collaboration. Of course, these contracts can become quite complex, especially when the two collaborating parties already have portfolios of intellectual property rights. So they have to consider that as well. For one thing, you can also co-own a patent that might be the result of the collaboration. So you are co-creating a new technology, and then both parties become co-owners of those patents. So that's a possibility. But what we see is that when the two parties, so when there is like a strong, large party, an established company versus maybe a young or small company with less experience with IP, that they tend to, the small companies or young companies tend to underestimate the importance of these IP contracts, and often they might end up not being included in the ownership of patents. So that's something to consider
when establishing a joint venture with a more mature partner.
Yes, for sure.
My final question, that is now a tradition that I ask all my guests. Can you please offer a word of advice for students?
Yeah, so I would definitely encourage students interested in international business to get some knowledge about IP. Maybe read the book that I mentioned at the beginning, which is not only about IP, but it's about the importance of intangibles for companies. And I would also say, okay, if you're thinking about writing your thesis project in international business, IP data is a great source of empirical material. You can track what companies are doing in terms of technological development, but also in terms of the markets they are entering. So it's great data to write your thesis work, and you can investigate many different questions about how companies operate internationally. And in terms of, I think also the exciting topics in IP land, I would say that more and more we will see consideration of ethical or responsible use of intellectual property. So we've already seen lots of discussion around patents and COVID-19 vaccines and the way pharmaceutical companies go about their intellectual property rights. So the societal discussion about, what do we get back as society from these very powerful rights that companies can use is going to be more and more important in the coming years, I would say. Something to think about.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for this insightful and enjoyable interview. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.